All right, get ready, because today we're going to dive into the future. And it's a future where our smartphones might not have any buttons at all. You heard me right. Buttonless phones. We found this really interesting article from Wired about companies working on this new tech, and I gotta say, I'm intrigued, but I'm also a little skeptical. What about you? Ready to explore this buttonless world?
Absolutely. I mean, it sounds kind of like science fiction at first, right? But when you really think about it, we're already pretty far down that road. We've already traded physical keyboards for touch screens. We said goodbye to the home button. Even the headphone jack is practically a thing of the past these days, so buttons disappearing completely. Yeah, maybe not so crazy after all.
Okay, you got a point there. Let's get into some specifics, though.
Yeah.
The article mentions some phones that have tried this buttonless thing out already.
Right. Do you remember the HTC U12 Plus? Back in 2018, it was one of the first phones to completely ditch physical buttons. It used pressure-sensitive sides instead. It was a cool idea. But it sounds like they didn't quite nail it. The article mentioned that it would accidentally activate sometimes, which honestly would drive me crazy. Imagine your phone constantly changing the volume or even turning off in your pocket.
Yeah, that would be super annoying.
Yeah.
What about phones like the Asus ROG Phone 2? That's a gaming phone that uses those touch-sensitive zones for shoulder triggers.
Yeah.
Seems like a pretty clever way to add functionality without adding actual buttons.
Oh, for sure. That's a perfect example of how buttonless tech can really improve things for specific uses. Gamers seem to love those virtual shoulder buttons. They make the whole experience so much more immersive. And it shows how much this technology has come along since those early days with the HTC phone. The ROG Phone 2 shows just how responsive and accurate those virtual buttons can be now. They feel almost as good as real buttons.
So we've got these early examples, but the article really highlights a company called Sentence. They seem to be one of the main players in this whole buttonless movement. What's so special about their technology?
Sentings is doing some really cool things, yeah. They developed this system that uses piezoelectric sensors and strain gauges. Basically, these sensors can tell exactly where and how hard you're pressing on the edges of the phone. So even though there's no actual button there, you still get that feeling of pressing a button.
Hold on. Piezoelectric sensors. Strain gauges. Can you explain that in a way that, people who aren't engineers can understand?
Sure. Think of the sensors as like tiny little pressure detectors, and they're super sensitive to even the lightest touch. Then you've got the strain gauges. Those measure how much the phone's surface bends when you press on it. So when you combine those two things, you get a system that can take your touch and turn it into a command. Basically, it's like a super sensitive digital nervous system. For the edges of your phone.
Okay, that makes way more sense. But why go through all this trouble to get rid of buttons in the first place? I mean, they seem to work just fine.
Well, Sentings has a few interesting arguments. First of all, there's the design. Taking away buttons lets you have a really sleek, smooth design. Like a seamless unibody is how they describe it. No bumps or ridges to get in the way. It's all about aesthetics.
Yeah.
That minimalist, futuristic look.
Yeah, I can see how that would be appealing. But is design really the only reason for this buttonless thing?
No, not at all. Space is another big factor. I mean, we keep stuffing more and more tech into our phones. Bigger batteries, better cameras, 5G components. Every little bit of space counts, right? So taking away those buttons frees up some valuable space inside the phone. Plus those waterfall displays, the ones that curve around the edges. They're becoming more and more popular, and buttons can be a problem for that kind of design.
That makes sense. Kind of reminds me of the whole headphone jack debate. Remember how spit-out constraints were a big part of the argument for getting rid of it?
Exactly. It's a constant theme in tech, figuring out how to do more with less space.
So true.
But there's another interesting argument for going buttonless. Customization. Imagine a phone where you could move the buttons around, or make new ones for specific things. You could even personalize how each button feels when you press it.
Now that's where things start to get interesting. Being able to customize the controls to fit exactly what you want and how you use your phone, that could be huge. I can already picture having a button just for opening my favorite podcast app, right where my thumb naturally goes. What about you? What kind of custom button would you make?
Ooh, that's a good one. I think I'd make a button that instantly mutes all notifications. Sometimes you just need a break from the digital world, But actually, Sentence isn't the only company doing this buttonless thing. There's another company called Sensel. They're taking a slightly different approach.
Okay, tell me more about Senthil. What makes their tech different from Sentence?
Well, Sensel uses those strain gauges we talked about, right? But Sensel uses high-resolution sensors that measure compression instead of strain. So instead of sensing how much the surface bends, they're sensing how much it, like, squishes.
So more buttons, and they're even more accurate. That's pretty impressive. So how does this compression-based approach actually work? And does it have any advantages over sense and strain-based tech?
It's like, imagine you press your finger into something soft. You can feel how much it gives in, right? That's basically what sensors are measuring. That tiny little bit of compression, it's super precise. And Sensel says it even works if you're wearing gloves or if you have a bulky case on your phone.
Wow, that's really cool. I can see how that would be useful.
It's
Especially like in the winter when you need to wear gloves all the time. Having your phone still work with gloves on, that would be awesome. But let's be real for a sec. People can be pretty attached to their buttons.
Hmm?
Do you really think people are going to be okay with this whole buttonless thing?
That's the big question, yeah. The Wired article talks about this a bit. It's kind of like, remember when phones used to have those physical keyboards? And then touch screens started taking over? Remember how much pushback there was? People were so skeptical they didn't want to change, and now look at us. We can't even imagine life without touch screens.
You're so right. We adapt, we learn new ways of doing things, and eventually, those things that seem so strange at first, they just become normal. But it's different, isn't it? Swiping on a screen is one thing, but using touch-sensitive areas for things like volume control, or even just turning your phone on and off, those are things we do without even thinking about it.
I know what you mean. The article mentions that too. That it might be tough for people to overcome that muscle memory, especially at first. Like finding those touch-sensitive areas in the dark without looking. But think about it. We've adapted to so many changes in technology already. Like, remember when we had to learn to use a mouse? Or how to use a touch screen? We figured it out. I'm pretty sure we can figure this out too.
Okay, you're convincing me, but what about haptic feedback? You know, when you press a real button, you get that click, that feeling that you actually press something. Can touch-sensitive areas really do that?
That's definitely a key thing to get right. The article talks about how important it is for buttonless designs to have good haptic feedback. They actually mention Apple's Force Touch trackpads as a good example. Those trackpads don't actually move when you press them, but they use haptics to make it feel like they do.
Yeah, I've used those trackpads. They're pretty good at mimicking that clicking feeling.
Mm.
It's subtle, but it really makes a difference. It makes you feel like you're actually pressing something. But what about the power button? I mean, when your phone is off, you can't see or feel where the power button is. How would that even work with a buttonless design?
That's one of the biggest challenges, yeah. And there's not really an easy answer yet. Some companies are trying out different things, like having a special spot on the back of the phone that you press to turn it on, or using voice commands to wake up the phone. It'll be interesting to see what they come up with.
It really feels like things are changing so fast. The way we use our devices, everything is changing.
Yeah.
And it's not just phones either. The article mentioned Sensel is working with a laptop company too,
Wow.
to put their technology into trackpads.
That's right. Imagine a laptop trackpad that can sense how hard you're pressing. You could do all sorts of things with that, like have different sensitivity levels for different actions, or even set up custom zones on the trackpad for different functions. It would be like combining a touch screen with a regular trackpad.
Wow. So buttonless tech could be coming to our laptops, our cars, maybe even our homes. It's exciting, but it's also a little scary.
Mm.
Are we heading towards a world where everything is touch sensitive?
It's definitely something to think about. But let's not get too carried away. This buttonless thing is still pretty new. There are definitely some things that still need to be worked out. Like, people need to actually try it out. They need to see how it can make their lives better.
I guess that's like with any new technology. It takes time for things to develop, for people to get used to it.
Yeah, if it's really useful and it makes sense, then people will start using it.
So what would you say are the best things about this buttonless world? What would make people want to give up their buttons?
Well, we've talked about a few things already, like how it can make phones look really sleek and futuristic, and how it frees up space inside the phone, and how you can customize the controls to fit how you use your phone. But beyond that, it could make using our devices feel more natural, more like an extension of ourselves.
I like that. It's not just about how it looks, but how it feels, how we connect with their devices. But let's get back to reality for a second. The article said that a phone company is planning to release a phone with Sentence technology pretty soon, at the Mobile World Congress in February.
Yeah, so we might be seeing buttonless phones on the market very soon. It'll be interesting to see what people think, if they love it or if they want to stick with their buttons.
I'm cautiously optimistic. I think this could be really innovative, but they need to do it right, especially with the haptic feedback and making sure it's easy to use.
For sure, it's all about the details. But we also have to remember that this isn't going to happen overnight. Like with touchscreens, it'll take time for people to adapt, for the technology to get better.
True. It's easy to get caught up in the hype, but real change takes time.
Exactly. It's an evolution, not a revolution.
That's a good way to put it.
And it's an evolution that's worth watching. Who knows? Maybe in a few years we'll all be like, remember when phones had buttons? That's so weird.
Uh-huh. Yeah, maybe. It's amazing how quickly things change in the tech world.
I know, right?
What seemed crazy a few years ago is totally normal now.
That's what makes it so exciting.
Keeps us on our toes. Makes us rethink everything.
Totally.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about what buttonless technology is, how it works. But I think there's a bigger question here. What happens when everything becomes touch sensitive? What would that world be like? And is that really the kind of world we want?
That's a big question. It makes you think, it's not just about phones and laptops anymore. It's about how we interact with everything around us. Our devices, our environment, maybe even each other.
It's a little overwhelming when you think about it. We're so used to having buttons, to that physical feeling. What happens when that's gone? Does it make us more connected to our devices? Or does it make us feel more disconnected?
It's kind of weird, right? Like on the one hand, touch interfaces can feel really natural, like you're actually touching and moving things around with your hands. But then there's something about pressing a real button, that click,
Yeah.
that tells you actually did something.
Yeah. It's like we're losing that physical connection for something that feels more digital. And it's not just about our phones, right? Imagine if everything was touch sensitive. Your car dashboard, your refrigerator. How do we even use things without getting totally confused?
That's where good design is super important. It's not enough to just get rid of buttons and slap a touchscreen on everything. You have to think about how people are going to use it, how to give them feedback, how to make it all work together.
Yeah. It's like a whole new challenge for designers.
Totally. But it's also a huge opportunity to rethink how we use technology.
I'm starting to see the potential here. It's not just about getting rid of buttons. It's about making technology easier to use, more natural. But what about accessibility? For people who can't see well, using touchscreens can be really hard.
Oh, absolutely. Accessibility is so important, especially as we move towards this touch-centric world. We need to make sure everyone can use these things, whether they can see or not. So things like audio cues, tactile feedback, those are really important.
So there's a lot to think about here, the good and the bad, but personally, what are you most excited about when it comes to this buttonless future?
Honestly, I think the coolest thing is how much you can personalize everything. Imagine being able to customize every interface exactly how you want it. Different layouts, different sensitivities, different haptic feedback. It would be amazing.
That would be pretty sweet. But it also makes me think about security. As our devices get more and more connected to our lives, and these touch interfaces get more advanced, how do we keep our information safe? How do we make sure these things can't be hacked?
That's a really important point. Security is absolutely crucial. We need strong encryption, good authentication methods. All those things are essential to protect our privacy.
Right. It seems like every new technology comes with its own set of challenges. But in the end, it's up to us to make sure it's used for good.
Definitely. It's not about just accepting every new gadget or gizmo that comes along. It's about making sure technology helps us, that it makes the world a better place.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the buttonless world. It's been a really interesting conversation. We talked about the technology, the potential benefits, the challenges. What are your final thoughts?
I think the biggest thing for me is this isn't just about making things look cool or making them smaller. It's about changing how we interact with technology, making it more intuitive, more personal.
Yeah.
And even though there are some hurdles to overcome, I think it's really exciting.
I totally agree. And for our listeners, keep an eye out for this technology. It might be coming to your pocket sooner than you think. Who knows? Maybe next time we do this, we'll be recording on a completely buttonless device.
That would be awesome.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time,